It's not even if you really remember the day of the week. It's, do you remember that day? Did that day that memorable moment occurred have such an effect on you that you remembered it? Good or bad? Was it a memorable event? And the question was posed to you, can a person really remember something decades ago? Cicely can. Cicely told you that for the first time in her young life, she felt what it was like to be a normal family. And that as she started to enjoy that normal family, all of a sudden it was gone. And for the next 12 years, she was told that her father had abandoned her because it was more important to him to go back to his old ways, to move to Canada and sell drugs. How about Gordon? You saw Gordon on the witness stand. 22 years later, Gordon remembers the day that he drove off his two-track and saw scorched earth and a burned body. Those are memorable events. Now, in reality, ladies and gentlemen, you've sat here for the last 6 days. When this is all said and done, this may be a memorable event for you. My cross-examination with the defendant on Friday, that may have been a memorable event. And thinking about that, if I offended any of you on Friday with the way I handled my cross-examination of the defendant, then I apologize. See, trials are adversarial. That's the whole process. And cross-examinations are interrogations. That's what we do. And see, as the prosecutors, we're responsible for bringing to you all the testimony and all the evidence. But beyond that, of being responsible for finding that person be guilty of murder beyond a reasonable doubt, I'm also responsible for protecting the rights of the victim. And on Friday, there were lots of statements made about Robert, a man who is dead and is unable to come into the courtroom and speak for himself. And so in that cross-examination, it was my responsibility as the people to make sure that Robert was heard. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the people brought you 9 witnesses and 142 pieces of evidence. And if you remember in the defense's opening, they told you that reasonable doubt was like taking your car and taking it to 0 to the speed limit. It was getting to that speed limit that got you past reasonable doubt. And see, that's exactly why I gave you Chris McMillan first. Chris McMillan laid out for you all of the testimony and showed you the exhibits that allowed you to see that the defendant was guilty of murder. Chris McMillan drove your car and took it to 0 way past the speed limit. In reality, when Chris McMillan was done, I could have sat down and rested, but I didn't. I gave you 8 other witnesses and a lot of other exhibits to show you why the defendant is guilty of these 2 charges. And I'm going to apologize now, ladies and gentlemen. Obviously, we took you through 16 years of investigation in 4 days. It was fast. Sometimes it was long, sometimes it was short. But there's a lot there. And I'd like to spend a little time with you showing you what those officers found in their 16 years of investigation and comparing it to what Detective Maltby finds when he sits down with Chris McMillan in 2018. So let's go back and start on May 8th, 2002, the day Gordon finds that dead body on his property. Now, in reality, ladies and gentlemen, you could be looking at me and saying, well, wait, you've been telling us the death actually happened on May 7th, 2002. Why aren't we starting there? And that's interesting, right? Because the defense pointed out in those things that might be memorable that over 62% of Americans own cell phones in 2002. Hearing that statement, it made me curious. In 2002, there were still over 1.7 million payphones left in America. And in 2002, over 95% of American households still owned landlines. But as Detective Maltby told you through his investigation, on May 7th, 2002, nobody bothered to pick up the phone to say Robert was missing or Robert was dead. In reality, it wasn't until October of 2002 that Robert's family came calling to say he was missing, and by then, the defendant was long gone. So we begin on May 8th, 2002. What does Gordon tell you? Gordon tells you that he does what he does almost every day. He goes to his property in Ottawa County, 152nd and Winans. And then he drives down a dirt road and he turns onto his two-track and he stops at a gate, a triangular gate. You have the picture of that gate as it looked in 2002. The triangular gate that crosses over his property. And he removes the chain and he opens up the gate and he begins to drive up the road. What does Gordon tell you as he sees? He sees something that was not there on May 7th, 2002. And that's charred ground, charred trees, and this body. Where's the clicker? Go ahead. He sees that. A dead person in and out of a trunk. And what does he do? He calls the police, and a lot of police come. And besides the police, Dr. Cole comes. Now, Dr. Cole told you, he testified on Friday, that he actually came to the scene. What does he tell you he observes? He smells. He can smell gasoline. He can see the scorched earth. As he approaches the body, he notices things. It's going to obviously be difficult to identify this person by their fingerprints because they don't have any. It's all been burned away. But he notices other things. He can see a piece of rope around this victim's neck. And he can see dental work. Dental work that he told you that even then he thought should be easy to identify this person because that dental work looks unique. And what did Detective Donker tell you? Detective Donker told you he was called out to Gordon's property. Detective Donker told you that he observed these same things. And that as he approached the scene, one of the first things that he was noticing was the smell of an accelerant. And when I asked him, "What do you mean by the smell of accelerant?" he said, "I smell gas." And Detective Donker told you that he observed those same things about the victim. He saw that rope. He saw that dental work. And he had his officers begin to investigate and look for anything important. And Detective Donker told you that as his officers began to search in and around the body, well, first off, he told you, that's the trunk. This item that you've had to look at and be near for the last week is the trunk that that individual was in when they came upon the scene. Just so we know it, we all know that in the end it was Robert that was found. That's the trunk that Robert was burned up in. But what else did Detective Donker tell you? That at the scene, right outside of the trunk, right in front of the area under ashes, was a hammer. And on Friday, Mr. Tetloff actually showed this to Dr. Cole, and I had previously shown it to Detective Donker. Was this the hammer that was found next to the trunk? This is the hammer, ladies and gentlemen. This was the hammer that was located right next to the trunk where Robert was found. And what did Detective Donker tell you also? That in reality, they searched. They searched hard. They went to gas stations. They talked to people. But in reality, there wasn't a lot of evidence to be found other than what they found right there. A trunk and a body and a hammer. And what did Dr. Cole tell you? Dr. Cole told you that the body was picked up and taken away. And Detective Donker advised you that when that body was picked up in the trunk, underneath it was this, the cushion, yellow at the time back in 2002. Like all of us, it may have aged over these years. But it was unique because it was one of the surviving things that had been found, and it was found directly underneath that trunk. Important enough to Detective Donker that he told you that that picture of that cushion was taken around to all the local areas to see if they could find it. And then Dr. Cole advised you at that time that Robert's taken in for the autopsy. When he's being pulled out of this trunk, this is found. A broken bat. And you actually heard from Detective Donker that these pieces, some of them were actually located in the bottom of the trunk. When they went back and looked through it, in the area where the remainder of Robert's fluids were. So now we have a hammer and a bat. And Dr. Cole tells you that he does the autopsy, and you got to see the pictures. This individual we now know as Robert, was struck on the left side of the head multiple times. separate marks, separate round circles. Round circles that, in Dr. Cole's opinion, would be done by the circular area of a hammer. And Dr. Cole told you that at least one of those holes, the individual, Robert, had been struck so hard that it actually broke the skull itself and pushed the bone back up in the brain. And that when Robert was hit, he was hit with such force that it actually bruised the other side of the brain. And that dental work. Dr. Cole told you that they took the dental work in the case of in the future that somebody would find them. And then you heard from Detective Darker again, who told you that they kept doing everything they could. After this, they actually went to a dentist to try to do an article to see if anybody recognized these teeth. In 2005, a video was actually produced, a documentary by a class at Hope College titled Jack in the Box, where they actually took some of the crime scene video that you saw, and talked about it in hopes that a person would be found. But from 2005 to 2015, the information that had been collected by Dr. Cole, Detective Donker, and all the people who worked on the case just went cold. Now let's start there and compare that to 2018. Detective Maltby has finally figured out who he believes this Chris person is. See, in 2005, we don't even know that there is a Chris. And when Detective Maltby sits down and speaks to him, Chris tells him what happened on the night of May 7th, 2002. Now, once again, Chris testified to you. He only knows the date because he's heard it here in court. But he remembers the day. He remembers the day that Robert died. And Chris laid out for you in testimony what happened before, on, and after May 7th, 2002. The same things that he laid out for Detective Maltby in 2018. And what he said was, before May 7th, 2002, before the date that Robert is killed, the defendant has a problem with Robert. Robert's abusing the kids. He's abusing her. He's got to go. That's what Chris McMillan remembers, is that the conversation that begins with Deneen, but always includes the defendant, making sure that they're actually discussing how to do it, is that Robert's got to go. And how's he got to go? They're going to lure him into the basement. They're going to hit him with a bat and then suffocate him with a bag. Interesting, right? Because those are two other items that Dr. Cole tells you he finds in the autopsy. He finds a rope around Robert's neck, and he finds a bag seared to the back of his head. And Chris advises Detective Maltby in 2018 and told you on the stand last Monday that the first time he hears it is in the sunroom. Deneen begins telling him this, and the defendant comes in the room frantic, making sure, are you telling him what we're going to do? Are you telling him the plan? And Chris tells you he doesn't really believe it. But then 3 days later, they're in the basement smoking weed. And once again, it's brought up. Chris told you that there was a bat in the basement, that it was always there. Interesting, right? Because Cicely told you that Robert's favorite team were the Cubs. Baseball was his life. Sammy Sosa was his guy. Not really hard to see that a basement's going to be in an area that Robert liked to be. A bat is going to be in an area like Robert liked to be. And Chris is playing with that bat, and Deneen advises him again, Robert's going to come down the stairs. We're going to get him down the stairs. You need to hit him with that bat. And then we're going to put a bag over his head and suffocate him. And while that's taking place, what happens again? The defendant comes down to make sure they understand the plan. Do you know what to do? And Chris advises Detective Maltby at that time, and you heard it from the witness stand again on Monday, that 3 days later, he's down in the basement again. Robert's not home. And that all of a sudden the basement door opens. He sees Robert going down the stairs. How does he see Robert going down the stairs? He told you. Get that next picture. Next one. He told you. Those white slats were there, but the wood behind it wasn't. He could look up and see Robert coming down those stairs. And as Robert came down the stairs, he was also able to look up and see the defendant behind him. And Chris told you that the defendant pushed Robert down those stairs and that Robert hit the bottom. And Chris told you that as he hit the bottom of the stairs, he swung that bat. He swung that bat so hard that it broke. What have we learned so far from Detective Donker and Dr. Cole? Inside that bat, inside this trunk with Robert is found a broken bat. And what does Chris tell you in 2018 and then on the witness stand? Once that bat breaks, Deneen has a hammer in her right hand, and she strikes Robert on the left side of his head, because Robert's on his knees in front of Deneen. Give me that other picture. You all saw these pictures, ladies and gentlemen. This is the basement at 334 Horatio. To your left would be the stairs. To your right would be the posts in the area where Robert sat. And at the bottom of that area, Robert was pushed down on his knees. The bat misses, and Chris tells you that Deneen strikes him in the head. Look at the pictures of Robert's head from Dr. Cole. There's multiple areas where strikes occurred. But that strikes aren't not good enough. And Chris tells you he hears the defendant yelling, "Give me the hammer, give me the hammer." And that with her left hand, strikes Robert on the left side of the head, hitting him so hard that it sticks in his head. What did Dr. Cole tell you? That round circular item hit Robert so hard that it pushed the bone back into his head. There was a hole. And what does Chris say happens then? He pulls the hammer out. There's so much blood. Those were his words. There's so much blood. What did Dr. Cole tell you? Dr. Cole told you that if you were to be struck in the head, you're going to bleed. It's going to happen. It's too thin an area not to. And what does Chris tell you happens then? Chris tells you that a bag is placed over Robert's head and a rope around that neck. The defendant is sitting on Robert's chest and Deneen is behind the head holding that bag and rope. And then Robert dies. Dr. Cole told you that with the injuries Robert received in that basement, he only had a few minutes to live. Maybe that bag helped make it go faster. But ladies and gentlemen, here's where you get to use your common sense in all of this, and I'm going to suggest that that's what you're going to want to do as you review all of this information from the last week. That bag was there to help pick up the blood because there was so much blood. But because there was so much blood was left in the basement. So that is the comparisons of what the detectives have learned from 2005. The trunk, a dead body, a bat, and a hammer, compared to the information that Detective Maltby already has in 2018 when he sits down across from Chris at Chris's home and gets that information. But there's more. Fast forward to April of 2015. Detective Donker testified that in April of 2015, he receives an email that you saw. And in that series of emails, as well as a few phone calls, Detective Donker learns a few things. This person emailing him is Deneen Deschamps, the daughter of the defendant. And she is concerned because she doesn't know why, but she's under the belief that the individual that she saw in the Jack in the Box video may actually be Robert Caraballo. Or also known as Juan Cintron. And that trunk that Robert is in, that trunk looks like a trunk that used to be in front of her mother's bed. And oh, by the way, I don't know why, but I believe my mom may have killed Robert. That's the information that in April and May of 2015, Detective Donker is now given. So what does Detective Donker do? Detective Donker then begins the process of figuring out who's Jack in the Box, who's the man in the trunk. And Detective Donker told you how he was able to go out to the federal prison system, how he was able to talk to people, how he was able to learn that during that time there were 2 Juan Cintrons in the system, and that one of those Juan Cintrons came up to Michigan. See, that's another thing. Deneen Deschamps had said, I believe that when he got out of prison, they moved up to the Lansing or Charlotte area. I really don't remember where. And Detective Donker was able to tell you that when he got the information concerning Robert, he was able to determine that he did move out to Michigan. And his first address was Harris, and the last address he had listed was 334 Horatio. And Detective Donker was able to find out that Robert's last check-in date with his parole officer was May 6, 2002. And even now in 2015, he's listed as an absconder because he never showed up again. And Detective Donker was able to grab the dental records of this Juan Cintron and have it compared with the individual that he found in 2002 and make that determination that this individual was Juan Cintron, also known as Robert Caraballo. And as Detective Donker told you, that's when he brings in the Eaton County Sheriff's Department and Detective Maltby to help investigate this case. Why? Because he knew he had a dead body in Ottawa County. But as Dr. Cole told you, when that autopsy was done, those lungs were clear. Robert hadn't died being burned alive there in Ottawa County. He was already dead. And so the question for Detective Donker at that time is, where exactly did he die? And the logical thing is to begin looking at 334 Horatio, the last place they could figure out where he lived. And what does Detective Maltby tell you at that time? He joins this investigation. He does preliminary investigations of the people. Detective Maltby tells you that he's able to learn that at the time that Robert would have been found dead, he had been living at 334 Horatio. Living there with him would have been the defendant, as well as Cicely and Tasha. And he also figured out that there was another person named Deneen Descharmes who lived there as well. Detective Maltby also told you that during this investigation, he's being given names of the family members that may know the defendant or who the defendant may be family members with. And because he knew the name of those family members, he made the decision at that time that he wouldn't interview them because he didn't want to spook any potential suspect. And you hear that they go to the house at 334 Horatio. By this point, it's abandoned, being remodeled, or at one point had been started. And it's in rough shape, but it's still standing, and they check the first floor. And you hear that they bring in the lab and that nothing is found. And so the determination is made to go to Texas. We have to interview the people who have called up to Detective Donker. And they told you that they interviewed a family member named Tanya. And they learned more family background, things that maybe they could use in their investigation. And they told you that they went and interviewed Deneen Descharmes. And during those interviews, they told you they were lengthy. But we brought out for you the things that they heard that were going to be things that they were immediately wanting to go investigate. That Deneen Descharmes informed them that the defendant had killed Robert in the basement. The first time they're hearing basement. That the defendant owned trunks, a green and a black one. And that the black one always sat next to her bed in her bedroom. She also told them that there was a person that was named Chris who was around there at the time. And that if you found Chris, he's going to be able to tell you exactly what happened. And one other point. Deneen Descharmes didn't remember why, but she remembered that there was chipping up concrete in the basement. And so what did the detectives do? They go back to 334 Horatio. When they go back, they see the same things that you're seeing now. They see areas of posts covered in white paint. They don't see chipped up concrete, but they see a patch to them that, while old, looks considerably newer than the concrete that's there itself. And so what do? Well, we spent most of Wednesday with you listening to two individuals, the lab analysts, one who specifically went to that house and the other who analyzed what they found. But what did they tell you? Go back one. No, other way. They told you that in that room, they found blood splatter, DNA. They found it underneath those white posts, and they found it on those white slats that went across. The slats that Chris told you were there back in 2002. Blood was found on that as well. Go back to that other basement one. And they also told you that on these posts, in those areas where it was just painted white, there was DNA underneath that. And then even though they couldn't find chipped up paint or chipped up concrete, they decided to pop up that patch and look under there. And under there they found a considerable amount of DNA. DNA which was tested and determined to be Robert Caraballo's. Let's contrast that and compare it to what Chris advises Detective Malpe in 2018 and what he told you. Chris told you that when the defendant struck Robert in the head and he pulled out that hammer, there was so much blood. There was blood everywhere. And he told you that after Robert was dead, they took off their clothes and put it in 5-gallon buckets, put new clothes on, and headed off to the dollar store to get bleach and ammonia and cleaning supplies. And he told you that the defendant and Deneen went to the basement and cleaned that basement. And he told you that that cleaning wasn't good enough, because a couple days later, they're back down in the basement. But this time, they're putting white paint on the posts. Not all over the posts, but just on certain spots. Why, Chris? To cover up the blood smears in the same areas where the lab 13 years later finds DNA. And he talks about how there was blood on the concrete and in the sand, and they chipped up that concrete. They chipped it up, and they mixed up concrete and covered it up with a patch. Why, Chris? We're just covering it up. Make it like it wasn't there. What were you covering up, Chris? That's where Robert died. So we were trying to cover up the blood that was left behind. And what did you do with all that, Chris? Well, we just carried it out of the house, and took it to a dumpster and threw it away. So this information that they're gathering from one individual, Deneen, they're then investigating in 2015 into locating blood splatter, DNA, Robert's DNA, in the basement of 334 Horatio. And then in 2018, when Detective Maltby has all this information, it's all being explained to him by Chris McMillan. But once again, it's 2015, so they don't know of Chris yet. They just know that maybe there was a Chris there. And Detective Maltby explains to you that during this process, he is attempting to figure out who this Chris McMillan is. He's looking him up through the law enforcement networks. He's looking him up through social media. But without having a real good idea of what this person looks like or who he may be, where he came from, he begins to think that maybe there really isn't a Chris at all. And after learning this, and as they continue their investigation, one of the things you heard from Detective Maltby and Detective Donker is that Robert's family is contacted. And that Robert's family explains to them how they tried to call in 2002. But as we know, by then, the defendant had already moved to Jamaica. And that they had gotten to know Cicely, Robert's daughter, and they really felt that the detectives should talk to her. So what did they do? They go back down to Texas. And you heard from Cicely. Cicely told you as well as the detectives that they had a lengthy conversation with her, 3 hours. They learned about Cicely's life. Unfortunately for you, you learned of it today, just like they learned of it in 2016. They learned what Cicely had to go through. They learned that from Cicely's perspective, she had been told for a lot of years that her father had abandoned her. Really only one of the good things that came out of the investigation that the detectives did and that they could share with Cicely that Robert hadn't abandoned her. It was okay to keep the memories that she had that he was trying to become a good dad, because they were the ones who had to inform Cicely that in reality, Robert had died in 2002. And they told you that it was Cicely who actually brought up the name Chris. That Cicely mentioned that her mom, her dad, her sister Tasha was there, her sister Deneen was around, and that Deneen brought around a friend named Chris. A friend named Chris that began hanging out even after, or if Deneen wasn't there. See, what did Cicely tell you last week? The defendant had a tendency to take Deneen's friends and make them her own. And that's what Cicely is telling Chris, is telling the detectives that Chris kind of became in that household. He just started hanging out. And Cicely told them how she remembered that her father was there and then he wasn't. And that she thought it was really weird because Her dad spent time in the basement. Her dad liked to read the Bible in the basement. But yet all of a sudden now, her dad's not there and the basement has a padlock on it. And even at 9 years old, Cicely is being told, your dad abandoned you. He left for Canada. But yet Cicely told you from the witness stand, even she realized from her young age of schooling that Canada was right there, and that you could drive your car to Canada, but yet her dad's vehicles are still sitting in the driveway. And then she worked up the courage to tell the detectives something, a couple more things. She told the detectives that because she was tired of feeling abandoned and because she had gotten to know her family in Puerto Rico, she went down for her grandmother's death, her funeral in 2014. And that because she knew her father spent so much time writing letters to her family, to his family, talking to his family, there was no way her father wasn't going to show up for his mom's own funeral. And you heard Cicely. She practiced what she was going to say to her dad. She was going to tell him of all the great things she had done and who she had become, and explain to him all the things he had missed out on when he decided to leave. But as she told the detective, she never got that opportunity because when she got down there, her father never showed. And she told you that while limited, the rumblings were that the family hadn't heard from him since 2002. And she tells the detectives that what she does is get mad. So she goes back up and confronts her mom. And when she confronts her mom, it's the same thing she told you on Monday. For the first time, the defendant's not saying that Robert abandoned her. Maybe one of the only times that Cicely can say, well, Mom's telling the truth now because now she's saying that Robert's dead. She was coming up the stairs. Robert grabbed her leg. She grabbed something off the post, grabbed it, swung with her right hand. He was bleeding profusely, and she ran upstairs and told Deneen, and for no apparent reason, Deneen and her friends just ran to the basement and took care of him. Cicely told you that she didn't ask a lot of questions, she just sat there. But at that point, obviously that relationship between her mom and her changed. And Cicely told the detectives about one other thing, a memory. A memory of being asleep and being placed in a car, in a van. Not uncommon, as she told you, that was her life. Of traveling a good distance, she doesn't know what. Of stopping, of seeing a large flame, of seeing her sister and hearing her mom tell her, go back to sleep. She didn't know what it meant, but that's what she remembered. Now, interesting, right? Because see, by 2016, Detective Donker and Detective Maltby are well aware of the scorched ground and charred trees. They told you about the intensity that those flames must have had to put scorch marks up, charring marks on trees 10 to 12 feet high in the air. Charring that Gordon told you he can still see on the trees 22 years later. They knew that information. And then Cicely's telling them what she remembers. Contrast that to Chris. Compare it to Chris. Chris tells you, just as he told Detective Maltby, that after Robert was killed, the defendant and the Deneen cleaned up. And then they waited for nighttime, dark, to move Robert out. And that when he came downstairs, Robert was in this trunk. And he told you, I knew Robert was in the trunk because this trunk would not close. It would not close completely, and he tried, and it wouldn't. And so, at that point, he and Deneen carry Robert out. You saw the stairs. You see the trunk. It's not going to be easy, and it's not going to be quiet to carry that body out. And they put it in Robert's van. .334 Horatio is in the city of Charlotte. Use your common sense, ladies and gentlemen. If you're going to move the dead body out of your basement and put it in your car in the city, you don't want to do that in the daytime, you're going to want to do it at night. Chris McMillan tells you that it happens after dark. And Chris tells you that they grab a gas can and put it in the van too. Because see, there's a plan. The plan is we're going to get rid of Robert and we're going to burn him up. And Chris tells you that the defendant says, grab the girls, get them in the car, and Deneen and he do that. And that Deneen Descharnes gets in the driver's seat, and he gets in the passenger seat, and the defendant gets in the middle seat. Why? Because in May of 2002, the only one that had a valid license was Deneen. And if you're going to get stopped and you're going to have a dead body in the car, it'd probably be smarter to have an actual person who had a license compared to someone who didn't. And so they head out and they stop at a gas station by the highway and they fill up. They fill up that van, they fill up that can, and they head out the highway. Now remember too, Chris told you, and he's telling the Detective Maltby in 2018 that he got here in November of 2001. We're now talking May 7th to the early morning hours of May 8th, 2002. Chris was from Texas. He moved up here to stay with his brother in Charlotte. And the farthest place he had ever been was St. John's. He doesn't know where he's going. He doesn't know where he went. All he knows is that it took at least 45 minutes to get there. But Chris tells you that when he gets there, they go down a dirt road and they stop at a 2-track. And when they stop at the 2-track, there is a triangular gate in front of that 2-track. How does he remember what the gate looked like? Well, they had backed the van up so that they could get Robert out, and those headlights or tail lights showed on the area where the gate was. And why does he remember that gate? Because they needed to grab something to help drag Robert, because they had to go underneath the gate with Robert to drag him up the 2-track road. So they grabbed a cushion, they put Robert on top of it, they dragged underneath that gate, and they proceeded to go up the 2-track road and then off to the side. And what does Chris tell you? Chris tells you that he and Deneen then come back to grab that gas can. The plan is to light Robert on fire. But when they get back, the defendant says, I want a ring off of Robert's hand. And so he and Deneen head back. Deneen begins pulling Robert out to get to his hands, and is unable to get that finger or get the ring. And so they go back and tell the defendant. And it is he and the defendant who walk back to Robert, where Robert is now out and in of the trunk, and she takes that ring. And at that point, Robert is covered in gasoline and lit on fire. And what does Chris tell you they do? When those flames go off, they go running down the road. They hop in the car, they get rid of their shoes, and they get back to Charlotte, really before the lights are even out, or before the sun is even up. But see, we'll go back to 2016. Detective Maltby's now been told twice about this Chris. He's also been told twice about the trunks. Detective Donker has learned about the trunks. Cicely is telling Detective Donker and Detective Maltby that the defendant owned black and green trunks. Robert was found in a black trunk. That green trunk, well, you saw pictures of that the detectives discovered that in a storage unit, the defendant's storage unit in Texas. You have the picture of that green trunk with her address on it, going to Jamaica. And Cicely also says, hey, maybe I can help you figure out who Chris is, and produces a picture of Chris with her half-sister Tasha from 2002. And Detective Maltby tells you that from that picture he's able to see a necklace as well as what it looks like him wearing some kind of Pittsburgh Steelers shirt, and that rings a bell. Rings a bell from a Facebook. So now he has a potential Chris. And in 2018, he goes and knocks on that door, sits down in Chris's house. And over 3 interviews, Chris explains to him what happened. All of those items that we've been comparing between what the officers had learned and now what Chris is saying. And as I said, Chris told him about the plan laid out by the defendant. Chris told him about how Robert was killed with the hammer, the bat being used, the trunk, the bag, and the rope. Chris told him about getting the body out of there. Chris told him about after the body was gone, after Robert was gone, actually before Robert was gone, the day Robert died, in between the times of Robert being dead and Robert's body being taken away, a padlock was put on a door. So now all of a sudden, Detective Maltby is hearing from Cicely that a padlock was put on her dad's basement area, and Chris McMillan is saying that a padlock was put on the door before the girls got home. And Chris is telling him of taking Robert away and lighting him on fire. And Chris is telling him how after that he basically just moved in with the defendant. And he talked about how he helped paint those posts in the basement and put that patch down to cover up Robert's blood. He told the detectives everything that had occurred on and before, on, and after May 7th, 2002. And he said, why? Because the defendant was saying that Robert had abused the girls and was abusing her, and he had to go. Ladies and gentlemen, as I told you in my opening, one of your responsibilities as jurors is to be judges of the witness's credibility. And I gave you a few things to think about as you listen to the witnesses. What does the person have to gain or lose in testifying a certain way? And whose interest is it that they testify? And what's at stake for the testimony that they give? Those are in reality all part of a jury instruction that Judge Cunningham will read you once the attorneys have sat down. You're also going to hear, how did the witness look and act while testifying? Did the witness seem to be making an honest effort to tell the truth, or did the witness seem to evade the questions and argue with the lawyers? I want you to think about that. Think about the witnesses as they took the witness stand and what they had to say. Did they attempt to tell you what happened, or did they seem to want to argue with the lawyers as to what potentially occurred? I'll leave that up to you to make that determination. But I am going to bring up that, in this case, the defendant testified. So not only do you have to consider all those other witnesses, you have to consider what the defendant said as well. Let's take a moment to compare how the defendant said the incidents of Robert being gone happened compared to the evidence that was found and the statements that were made by the witnesses. The defendant told you that she had been in a relation with Robert since 1988. And that in 1993, she actually gave birth to Cicely. And that in 2001, after following Robert around to Texas and Louisiana, she had moved up to Michigan and ended up at that 334 Horatio home. And even though it was difficult, she finally had to admit to me that Robert was paroled to that Charlotte area to live up here. Facts that we know from Detective Donker, because Detective Donker was able to determine that while on parole, Robert's last known address was 334 Horatio. But yet, when the defendant took the stand, how did she act? Remember, we're talking about an incident that happened 20 years ago. So while the defendant who took the stand may have looked the way she looked today, remember, we're not talking about an action that took place yesterday. And Cicely told you that her mom's the boss. Everybody knew it. Her daughters knew it. Cicely even told you that when Robert came back into her life, if there was an order given by Robert and her dad, or an order given by her mom, yes, she's going to follow her mom's order. She's not going to listen to her dad. The defendant was the boss. It was her family. It had always been her family. Cicely advised you that. And Cicely advised you that, just as she did today, Deneen and the defendant were partners in crime. But the person in charge, well, that was always her mom. Deneen was the wingman or the henchman. But the defendant, she was going to be the boss. But how did the defendant portray herself? I had to actually ask because I didn't know if English was her second language. Even though she admitted that she grew up in Connecticut and Michigan, she was American. But yet on Friday, she portrayed herself as a fragile, old Italian woman who didn't seem to understand English. And she was quiet, so quiet. And while you'll forgive me, ladies and gentlemen, I have been accused of being deaf. I think I wasn't the only one that day who couldn't hear the defendant actually speak. But why is that? Because in 2002, even Chris told you that it wasn't long for him to figure out, being around that house at 334 Horatio, who ruled the place. Sure, Robert was stern, but Robert's way of dealing with things, he went to the basement. It was the defendant who had control of that home. But what did the defendant tell you? The defendant told you that, no, that's not how it was. I just didn't understand ethnic men. Ethnic men somehow are different than other men in the sense that she had to be quiet and docile and just cook. A little bit different than what the other witnesses were telling you. And how she loved that man, as she said in the very beginning, I even love him past death. I found that interesting to say. I loved him past death. I mean, that'd be a heartwarming statement to make, except for the fact that a man was killed and his body was burned. But she claimed that she was, very quiet, that Robert controlled the house. He was controlling, right? and that whatever he said went. Interesting, she also made comments too that she never went to the basement. On cross-examination, she claimed that Robert never read the Bible. Even though, interesting enough, from the investigations that Detective Maltby and Detective Donker were hearing from the individuals they were interviewing, Cicely and Chris both told you on the stand, that was Robert's thing. Go to the basement, read the Bible, write letters, talk to his family. That's where he was at in his life. But for the defendant, no, that didn't happen. He didn't read the Bible. And she never went to the basement. She didn't know what the basement looked like. You had Cicely and Chris both agree that in that basement, right in that area where the patch was a desk and a chair. That was Robert's area. That's where he hung out. But yet when the defendant takes the stand, no, it's in a completely different area of the house. Behind and back. Pretty much back, if you're thinking of the picture where I would be standing in that picture. Even though I'm not sure how she'd ever know that because she claims she never went to the basement, so she'd have no idea where Robert's chair should have been. And then she talks about that day. And this is where we come back to memorable events. As I told you, you're not always going to remember the date. You're not always going to remember the day of the week. But is losing the love of your life, who you love even past death, worthy of a memorable event? Is it worthy to be able to remember the day that your husband was no longer there? And how did that go? On direct, it was very vague. She was there, she was cooking, she came downstairs, please come to dinner. She only went down 3 or 4 steps. We're talking, allow me to back up. On that day, the day Robert dies, somehow or another, Robert's been told by some random dude at a gas station that Denine's gay, Chris is a bum, and they're both doing drugs, and they gotta go. That day, he's no longer around the house. And then he comes home and tells the defendant that. And that the defendant is shocked. She had no idea her daughter was gay. And this man who's basically just moved into the house, she had no idea that he was a bum. But she tells Denine, you better talk to him now or you're going to have to leave. There's no intervening by the mom. There's no, can we have a conversation? Let's sit down at the dinner table, a smangia over some pasta, and we'll talk it out. Good Italian way. No, there's none of that. You deal with it. And they go to the basement. And she goes down a couple times asking if they want dinner. And they keep telling her to leave him alone. And in this time, she's doing her good wifely duties. She's taking care of the children. She's fed them. It's maybe not even 6 o'clock. Thinking about it, they just got out of school around 3:15 or 3:30, and they're 9 and 11, and it's May 7th, and I'll leave that up to your common sense of whether it's still light out at 6 o'clock on May 7th of any year. But those kids are already going back to bed. You know, they're going to bed. They're winding down for the night at 6 o'clock at night. And then she never hears anything. I have a picture of the upstairs. She never hears anything, and she's working in the kitchen and dining room or going to her, what's called the living room, her bedroom. And you can see the stairs there in front of you. And she goes down that third time. And that for some unknown reason, someone grabs her foot. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I would suggest to you, well, I won't suggest to you, I will tell you, you get to use your common sense. You get to look at what is reasonable. She doesn't go, hey, what are you doing? Who grabbed me? She doesn't ask what's going on. She tells you that her reaction when she's grabbed on her foot is to reach down 2, 3, 4 more steps. And I'll let you look back at the pictures of the stairs that go to that old Michigan basement. But she manages to reach down all those steps and she grabs something. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I'll leave it up to you, but what I heard her describe was a caveman tool. She said it was wood, with maybe a rock on top and cloth. I asked her to describe it. She couldn't describe it. I offered her the opportunity to draw it out. She refused. So I'm left with a caveman tool. And she managed to go down those 4 steps without falling over, grab that caveman tool, using her right hand, swipe back at her husband. Well, she didn't know who she swiped back at, but when she turns around, her husband has a scratch on him. Now remember, Cicely told you that when it happened, the defendant used the word profusely. It was a word Cicely remembered. Crowbar and profusely. But yet on cross-examination, it was a surface wound. A little peroxide and a cloth that had cleaned all up. That's why she didn't care, because she said it wasn't bad at all. And in reality, it didn't matter because she was ordered upstairs again. And being the good wife, that's what she did. And ladies and gentlemen, please, I'm going to say this to the lady jurors in reality, but the men too. When I'm saying things like being the good wife, please, I'm not attempting to be derogatory. That's not what I mean at all. But you'll have to reflect on what you heard. But that's what I was hearing, is how she was portraying herself for that day. That she was this quiet, docile woman whose responsibilities were to just take care of the household, take care of the children, take care of the man. And whatever the man said went. So when she was ordered back up those stairs, that's what she did. And she laid those children down, and she went to her room and laid down, and it was quiet. She said she never heard anything. Let's contrast that to the information you had been provided with earlier in the week. Chris McMillan tells you that a bat is broken. A broken bat is found in the trunk where Robert is dead. You can use your common sense and experiences to reflect on what a bat would sound like when it breaks, what a bat would sound like when it hits a post. How much noise does it make? And Dr. Cole told you that Robert died of blunt force trauma, multiple strikes to the head by something that looked like a hammer. And Chris told you that in that basement, Deneen hit Robert as well as the defendant. Ask yourself, if a person were struck in the head with an item such as a hammer, how much noise would they make? If a person were struck in the head with a hammer when they didn't know it was coming, how much noise would they make? What pain would you be in when you were struck with that hammer in the head? But she hears nothing. And she continues to lay on the bed. It is quiet. And she doesn't even know Robert is being taken out of the house. You can look at the sketch, ladies and gentlemen. Where she is, the room she's in is right next to the basement. This is the item that Robert was found in. You saw the pictures of the stairs. If you've ever moved anything once in your life, you know the difficulties that you have moving it. A dead man is in this trunk. I would submit that it's going to take more than one person to carry this trunk out of the basement. And when doing so, what kind of noise are you going to make? What kind of noise are you going to make to get them to the van? But yet she hears nothing. She doesn't hear, well, I'll take that back. At some point during this, Deneen comes running upstairs saying, Mommy, Mommy, help me. Well, I'm going to suggest to you that a 21-year-old who is calling their mother Mommy may not be the person who's actually in charge of that household. But yet on direct, she says, I didn't know what she wanted. I didn't understand her. And then she went away and I went and laid down. On cross-examination, that's when she said, Deneen told me that Robert was dead. See, remember on direct, she's telling you she has no idea when Robert died. She didn't know Robert was dead. All she knew is that all of a sudden her children are in the car, and now she's scared of Chris, and she was ordered to drive them away. But yet when confronted with that of, well, wait a minute, you're the mom, it's your house, you own it. You've heard absolutely nothing. Why are your children in the car? Well, I don't know, they were put in the car. Well, why don't you just take them out? Tell them, no, I'm not going to drive you around. I don't know what's going on. I have no involvement in this. Give me back my children. Go on your way. Then all of a sudden it became, I'm scared of Chris. Chris, who is basically moved in with them. On that day, all of a sudden, she becomes scared. On cross-examination, it's then she changes and goes, well, Deneen came upstairs and saying, Mommy, Mommy, help me, I've killed Robert. But even then, when asked, what did you do? Nothing. I went and laid down. This is your love. Your husband, somebody's just told you your husband's dead. You don't check on him. You don't try to figure out what happened. You don't do anything. Your memory of the event is you went, I went and laid down. And when confronted as to why do you get in that van, why don't you just take the kids? It's only on cross-examination where she said, well, they told me that Robert was in the van. Well, did you hear him bring Robert out of the van? Well, no, I heard nothing. Did you know they brought Robert out of the van? No, they just told me. I never saw Robert. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, there's a sketch. There's no possible way you're not seeing an individual or two individuals walk around that house with a dead person in it without seeing it. You're not going to not be able to hear something. But yet for her, the day Robert's gone, it's not a memorable event. And then the driving. She felt it necessary to emphasize some 3 houses that she went to. For whatever reason, I have no idea. None of those houses were discussed by anyone other than her. She had nothing to show that she actually did. And she's telling you that she's going to these 3 houses when it's still daylight. So Robert's been carried out of the house while it's still daylight. And then she drives. And she tells you she doesn't know where she drove. It was all Chris. Ladies and gentlemen, you had the opportunity to see Chris. I'll leave it up to you to make the determination whether you put Chris as being the mastermind of criminal actions in the world. But it was all Chris. He knew where to go, and he told her where to go, and she's scared of him, so she did. And she got to some road. She didn't even think it was a dirt road. Doesn't remember anything about it. Remembers that Chris and Deneen pulled something out of the trunk, but she couldn't see it. She didn't look around. And they went away. When confronted of, wait a minute, the person that you're scared of, the people that you're scared of are now out of the car. You have your children, you're safe. Why don't you leave? I don't know. You were that scared. Why didn't you go? I don't know. And then the tears. Because then there's the explosion. It shook the ground, it shook the world when they blew up Robert. Now, ladies and gentlemen, you saw the charring that occurred. I'm going to admit that there was probably some action when all that gasoline is laid out and lit on fire. Any of you who have ever lit a big campfire knows that. But yet that's the only reaction she gets. And if that reaction causes tears, then when she's asked the question, why didn't you call? Why didn't you call police? Why didn't you do something? What does she say on cross-examination? I called my family. We don't call the police, we call our family. Our family takes care of things. You ain't kidding. She and her family took care of things on May 7th, 2002. And after that, what does she tell you? Oh, about 6 weeks later, I left for Jamaica. And when confronted with that, She said that 6 weeks she packs it up or takes the things she wants to take, just leaves the house. That she goes to see the love of her life. As Cicely told you, this had been a 20-year love affair. But at the same point, she had Robert and was supposedly, following him around. And when I said, well, isn't it true within about 3 days you were actually living in his house? She said, 1 day. She could remember that day. Remember that day, it only took 1 day to be back in Riley's house. And within a year, she's getting married and having another child. But when that's brought back to Robert, what about Robert? Why didn't you do anything about Robert? It was always just vague. It was always just, there was nothing there. That was not a memorable moment for her. And ladies and gentlemen, please, the things I'm talking about this morning, those are the things that I, as one of the prosecutors, remember. I asked you to pay attention, and you did. You all listened to the witnesses, and you looked at the exhibit, and that's important. Because 12 of you will go into that back room, and it'll be the 12 of you together who will make the determination as to whether the defendant's guilty. So maybe you think of something right now that you feel it's important that I haven't said. That's okay too, because you bring that out in the jury room and you discuss that as well. I'm close, Judge, if that helps.
Okay.
One final instruction, and Judge has got a ton for you that she's going to read. She usually needs water because there's that many that she's got to get through. But one of the instructions she's going to read to you is regarding aiding and abetting. Basically, that says is what that means is that you're going to be advised that anyone who intentionally assists someone else in committing a crime is as guilty as the person who directly committed it. And ladies and gentlemen, it's the people's contention that that's exactly what occurred. Robert got paroled and told the defendant, I want out of the business. I want someplace where I can just lead a normal life and be a normal dad. Charlotte, Michigan is where the defendant came. Why? Because she knew a lot of family. And that's where Robert was paroled too. And as you heard through the testimony, Robert took on that normal life. Did a bunch of paper routes. As Cicely said, he was a handyman as well. But the main thing he was doing, the main thing Cicely was noticing, is he was trying to be a dad. The rules were getting changed in the house. Oh, there were actually rules that were being put in the house. That he was getting Cicely into extracurricular activities. He was doing things with his daughter that a daughter would want to have happen. He was trying to become that good dad again, that good parent. But see, in those months that occurred, that was conflicting with the defendant and how she liked to live her life. Because as you heard from Cicely, we hadn't had that structure until Robert showed up. That's not how we lived. We lived by going with Mom and Deneen to the mall and stealing a bunch of stuff and returning it for gift cards and then selling it. That's how we lived. Structure was not really something that was there. And in those months that Robert was there, the defendant was figuring out that Robert being around was cramping her lifestyle. And as you heard from Chris, a week before Robert dies, Deneen and the defendant speak to him saying, Robert's got to go. And that 3 days before Robert dies, Chris is telling you that Deneen is in the basement, the defendant comes down, and once again, that plan is formulated for Robert to be killed. And on the day it happened, that's exactly what occurred. Chris told you that the boss of that plan was the defendant. But he also told you that he and Deneen were right along with her in making it happen. Everything that occurred, most things that occurred, involved all three of them. The things that Chris claimed he wasn't involved in, such as cleaning up the basement originally, he was down there the second time putting paint over the smeared blood because the cleaning fluids wouldn't clear it off. And what happens after this happens? Within months of Robert being there, the lifestyle the defendant has come to know has been changed. Robert wants his daughter to be in a normal household, living that life that every daughter should. That had to change. And in the minute Robert's dead, within 6 weeks, the defendant has left that town, has gone to Jamaica to move on with her lifestyle with the new love of her life. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I have no idea when I started, to be honest with you, but I'm guessing I probably spoke for over an hour. Ladies and gentlemen, I've presented to you, Mr. Tetloff has presented to you, the detectives have presented to you. We've given you 9 witnesses and 142 exhibits. We've shown you Robert. We've shown you the trunk that Robert died in. We've shown you the hammer that was found around Robert's body that was used to kill him. We've shown you the bat that was discussed. You've seen the physical evidence of the rope around his neck and the bag around his head. All of these items are here for you. And it's a lot, ladies and gentlemen. 142 exhibits is a lot. 9 witnesses over 6 days is a lot. But as I told you clear back in voir dire, the prosecution was going to put up the witnesses and present the evidence that we felt would show you that the defendant was guilty. We've done that, ladies and gentlemen. The defendant is guilty of murder too, and of burning dead bodies. But as I close out, I'd like you to think about something else, because it's something that in every trial I worry about. Because as I told you in the beginning, as the prosecutor, I'm responsible for making sure that a crime was committed and that it's the defendant that committed that crime. And if so, showing you that. But see, Robert was the victim in this matter. Robert has rights. He had rights. Victims have rights. And so for me, it's always important to make sure, did I actually allow Robert to be hurt? Because that's important. It's important that you heard Robert during this trial. And last night, as I thought about it, I reflected back, and I felt that you actually got to. For all the bad that occurred before, on, and after May 7th, 2002, you actually got to hear a little good of who Robert was as the person who he was striving to become. And that's important too, that we think about that when we think of all this. Ladies and gentlemen, I presented you everything you need. And as I told you in the beginning of this trial, at the end of this case, I was going to be requesting that you return with a verdict of guilty. It's time, ladies and gentlemen. After we finish one more round of this speaking, you will go back to that jury room. And at that time, I'm going to request that you return with that verdict of guilty. Thank you.